Hello, everyone. My name is Grady Thurman, and I, along with Grant Anderson, will be presenting today on the legacy of the Vietnam War. And to set the stage for the period of the Vietnam War, it's very essential to recognize the intensity of the time period, along with the major struggles that the United States was facing within its own borders. The 1960s alone was one of the most tumultuous times in U.S. history. It was marked by significant political and cultural upheavals, um, including things like the Civil Rights Movement, the assassination of key figures like John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. In addition to this, the country was gripped by lasting Cold War fears, making the U.S. highly sensitive to any perceived threat of the spread of communism. Now, these factors all contributed to this tension that the United States faced within our own borders. It is absolutely key to understand and account for this tension when thinking about the Vietnam War, as it sets the foundation for the criticism from public opinion um, of the war in Vietnam. The country was already facing these challenges domestically, and a heavily disputed war only added to a larger narrative in which Americans grappled with many contrasting and conflicting ideas. Involvement in Vietnam pre-Johnson under Kennedy was basically based upon this theory, the domino theory, which was the idea that if one country fell to communism, neighboring countries would likely do the same. Vietnam, therefore, was viewed as a crucial line of defense against the communist expansion in Asia. Um, Kennedy also saw U.S. involvement in Vietnam as a way to continue to show American resolve and maintain this idea that U.S. would maintain um, a strong stance in the global fight against communism without committing to full-scale war. This involvement was portrayed to the public just as such, aiming to symbolize a common theme in American history where we are seen as the good guys or the saviors. Um, it is our responsibility to save those in need. Nonetheless, Kennedy's administration continued to slowly escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and this, coupled with his eventual assassination in November of 1963, set the stage for further engagement under President Lyndon Johnson, which takes us to Tonkin. On August 1st, 1964, American survey ship the Maddox was conducting surveillance of North Vietnamese waters in the Tonkin Gulf. The ship was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats and planes from a nearby carrier, though the ship was able to escape without any initial damages. Johnson was angered by this. He sent the Maddox to return to those same waters, accompanied by another ship, the Sea Turner Joy. Now, both of these ships reported another attack by torpedo boats, although it's argued whether this attack really ever happened or how serious this attack really was. Johnson, however, used these attacks as a reason to call for a severe emergency and military action. He secured congressional approval of a resolution, which part of it was combined with prior contingency planning for airstrikes in North Vietnam, but ultimately it gave the president the power to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attacks against the forces of the United States and to prevent any further aggression. This would become known as the Tonkin Resolution and would act as the legal basis that both Johnson and Nixon's administrations further prosecuted the Vietnam War. It is true that initially Johnson did not use this Tonkin Resolution to ramp up major war efforts in Vietnam. He did try and hope to continue to respond accordingly to North Vietnamese actions, try and stay out of full-scale war. However, government instability ensued in South Vietnam, and much of this would have to change. He began to increase continual bombing in North Vietnam in February of 1965, and in March he ordered American ground troops to the airfields and to oversee where these bombing raids were going to take place. A month later, he ordered 40,000 more troops to be sent to protect populations across South Vietnam. And through all of this, the same narrative was attempted to be portrayed to the U.S. public. We're the good guys. We're aiming to save the world. the spread of communism, and the North Vietnamese are the bad guys. They're the aggressors. They're the ones that are, fueling this fire. As the war progressed and more troops flooded into Vietnam, Johnson continued to deny that his actions constituted a change of policy. He didn't think there was a need to. His administration issued a white paper that continued to blame the war in the South on North Vietnamese aggression, and he refused to seek a firm mandate from Congress in the country for full-scale war. Johnson used the Tonkin Gulf Resolution as authority for all of his actions. He failed to report that American escalation was designed not so much to win the war, but to improve South Vietnam's morale and prevent the nation's imminent collapse. He declined to raise taxes to support the war out of fear of political opposition or public dispute. The combination of this increased government spending on military actions paired with the, increased domestic spending in the time of the 60s ultimately contributed to a devastating inflation in the 1970s. There were moments where Johnson would try to push back against the rising number of critics. He attempted to seek peace initiatives, use diplomacy, and even bribe North Vietnamese forces with economic stability. However, it never worked, and by July 1965, he called for another 100,000 troops to be sent to Vietnam. By 1967, South Vietnam and the United States were no closer to victory than they had been ever. Despite numerous troop increases, the war continued on. At that point, almost half a million American soldiers were fighting in Vietnam, and the U.S. Air Force had dropped more bombs in Vietnam than in all theaters of World War II. By 1968, Johnson had realized that handling the Vietnam War would ultimately be his demise and reason enough for the end of his presidential career. In March of 1968, he gave a speech that aimed to end almost all bombing in North Vietnam and announced that he would not run for re-election. Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War set the stage for deep and lasting distrust between the U.S. government and its citizens. His failure to properly educate and announce what was really happening in fear of any sort of public dispute or unrest created this void between the U.S. people and its military leaders. This lack of transparency became increasingly apparent to the public, who began to realize that the administration was presenting an oversimplistic narrative and entirely blaming North Vietnam for the conflict.
President Richard Nixon took oath of office on January 20, 1969, taking over for Johnson after years of fighting a stalemate in Vietnam, and the American people's perspective on the war was changing. As you can see, the large arrow shows where the American people switched from a more positive view on the war to a more negative view. This almost perfectly is when Nixon took office. Up until this point, most Americans still believed the American government and military could provide peace and stability to Vietnam, but after 1968 and 1969, more and more Americans were getting more negative about the war, and we're just seeing so many red flags, and perspective is just changing at this point. And this change in perspective wasn't just towards American involvement in Vietnam, but on a larger scale, American relations on foreign diplomacy as a whole. Americans were becoming less and less likely to support military deployment to foreign bodies, and were less and less sure that America is really standing for what it stands for what it says it stands for, this being peace, freedom, justice, and security. Further events that pushed America more into the negative about the war were the My Lai massacre of 1968, where American soldiers brutally raped, mutilated, and murdered 350 to 500 unarmed women, children, and men. This tragedy was rightfully met with disgust and horror by the American people, and soured public opinion about Vietnam and the war. Another event that sowed distrust between the U.S. government and its people was the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, which revealed a study about the misleading statements and reports about the Vietnam War, furthering the American people's discontent and skepticism of the U.S. government and military. In 1973, President Nixon gave a speech on the Vietnam Peace Agreement, and it explains the U.S.'s departure from South Vietnam. American forces will be withdrawn, and South Vietnam will have a free election. America will have peace with honor. Nixon knows all too well that as soon as the U.S. leaves, South Vietnam will crumble and fall to the north, ending nearly 20 years of wartime effort in Vietnam, with far less than the U.S. entered in with, and countless lives essentially thrown away. Is this peace? Is this honorable to have a treaty look good on paper when you know very well how paper thin it is? I say no. As the beacon of hope that the U.S. is supposed to stand for, its leaders can't just ignore reality and call it whatever they want. Where's the honor in that?
We looked at Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, how they all handled the Vietnam War. So, what legacy did this war really leave behind? We've touched on it before, but Vietnam led to a cultural and political shift that some have described as the American Reckoning, which basically means like a wake-up call to the American people as to what's going on in our country, how the people that we're supposed to be listening to are leading it, and what are we blind to. The conflict, the Vietnam War, created widespread distrust and cynicism about the U.S. government and military leaders. Many Americans now view these leaders as liars or question the morality of their decisions. Um, Along with this, the failure of Vietnam caused Americans to question the role of the United States and question the actions and really ask, why is it that we're doing what we're doing? Um, Along with this, the war drove a wedge between the United States and some of its allies, especially the French, who had failed in Vietnam before and now heavily criticized America's aggressive approach in Vietnam, viewing it as dangerous or misguided to oppose our American ideals on another country. For the people of the United States, it now seemed harder than ever to justify these U.S. interventions um, and feel good about our idea of advancing democracy and freedom. Public opposition to military action rose dramatically, with a majority opposing involvement abroad except in cases of direct invasions. The conflict slowly began to replace Munich as the most potent symbol of what the United States should avoid in foreign policy, which we should touch on foreign policy now. So, from a foreign policy perspective, one of the key lessons that Americans learned from Vietnam is that the United States should avoid getting involved in foreign conflicts without clear support from the local population. After the war, uh, American leaders, journalists, and historians felt that the U.S. had made a mistake by getting drawn into a war uh, due to anti-communist sentiment. Um, so it should be touched on that the U.S. got involved in a war where the country itself wasn't on the same page as what the U.S. wanted for the country. We think of Cuba, we think of the Philippines, similar scenarios. Um, this rigid approach of fighting for what the U.S. believes in right in this sense, communism, led to an intervention without fully understanding the needs and desires of the Vietnamese people themselves. Another major reason that many saw this war as unwinnable was because the South Vietnamese government um, lacked legitimacy and power among the people that made the country itself. This lack of support made it difficult for the U.S. to offer legitimate aid or really help them in the war. Um, the U.S. also faced heavy criticism because ultimately South Vietnam fell to the north, despite all of the efforts, financial aid, and military loss offered by America. Many argued that the U.S. made a very critical mistake in backing an unpopular and corrupt government at the time, which again lacked the support of its own people. This lack of support made it hard to build a stable resistance against North Vietnam. Many South Vietnamese saw the North as a nationalist force rather than saw the dangers of communism. Um, by focusing on stopping communism without understanding the local situation and how the people felt, the U.S. overlooked that this war was largely about Vietnamese self-determination rather than the fight against communism.
In 1984, Caspar Weinberger gave a speech on 6 criteria the United States must fulfill before the U.S. commits troops in the developing world. Number 1, the area should be vital to the national security. Number 2, the United States should intervene only if it had a clear intention of winning. Number 3, the United States should have well-defined interests and objectives. Number 4, the government should be flexible and willing to adjust the size, composition, and disposition of forces. Number 5, the government should use American troops only as a last resort. And number 6, the government should send troops only if it had reasonable assurance of popular and congressional support in the United States. This speech shows the change in American temperament towards foreign diplomacy in the post-Vietnam War era, only 10 years after the fact. These 6 criteria are very similar to the concepts of jus ad bellum, showing that America does not want to bother with unruly and unnecessary military control and force. In the end, the United States left a legacy of deceit, brutality, distrust, and discontentment in Vietnam and America. The Vietnam War drastically changed the U.S. perspective and approach to foreign affairs and military deployment. After the war, the U.S. people no longer trusted elected government officials or the military, both sworn to protect the people of the United States. America's longest war was one of, if not the most influential on the development and state of American imperialism today.